We're now getting close to the end of our study of Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments, and we're focusing on yet another sort of joint part of the composition, something in between the chapters. Previously we looked at an appendix to chapter 3 that was a bridge between chapter 3 and chapter 4. Now we're looking at this part that he calls an interlude between chapter 4 and chapter 5. And chapter 4 was the case of the contemporary disciple. So it had to do with how it was that a person who would be present at what has come to be known as the Christ event, but it's kind of misleading to call it an event since it takes place over time. But the idea is that the people who are able to participate in and be present at the sort of coming into being of the eternal, the eruption of the eternal into time and history. And we saw why this would be something that could make sense from Kierkegaard's perspective, something that reason could even grasp, although it had to grasp this as a paradox. And then the contemporary disciple couldn't just be anybody, and there were certain types of knowledge that the contemporary disciple would be less inclined to be involved with. And you know, we talked about how they would apprehend this through what Kierkegaard is calling faith, and he has his own particular understanding of faith, which we'll go into a little bit more. Now the interlude is a joint, like I said, between the contemporary disciple, so people around the time of Christ, and the disciple at second hand, which is what chapter 5, the last chapter of the work, is about. Who is the disciple at second hand? Well, it would be somebody like Kierkegaard, or it would be somebody else who sees things the same way, lives the same kind of life in relation to the paradox, to God. So he says, and he's again addressing the reader, "Let us now assume this teacher has made his appearance, he's dead and buried, and that sometime intervenes between chapters 4 and chapter 5. Likewise, it sometimes happens in a comedy that several years elapse between two successive acts. In order to indicate this passage of time, the orchestra is occasionally made to play a symphony or the like, foreshortening the time and filling it with music." So he's using a dramatic metaphor here, and he says, I'm not going to fill it with music, I'm going to fill it with words. And what kind of words does he actually pick? Well, this is probably the most metaphysical and most sort of explicitly philosophical portions of the work. So, you know, if this is philosophical fragments, here we're actually dealing with something that's like straight out metaphysics, dealing with time, eternity, coming to being, to a certain extent some epistemology, dealing with the question of knowledge and what is knowledge, what isn't knowledge. So it's kind of a funny little interlude if you're following this metaphor. So he says, "How long this interval should be I'm content to leave to your discretion, but if it seems agreeable to you, let us in a spirit of jest and earnest assume that precisely 1843 years have elapsed." Why that number? That's when he's writing this, right? So how many years since now notice he's not talking about the crucifixion, he's not talking about the ministry of Christ or anything like that. He's charting this from the incarnation, which is kind of interesting. He's not going to talk a lot about that, per se. He's talking about the teacher is actually going around teaching, but he's actually charting this from the point where God enters into time in a determinate way. So he says, "You'll note I ought to proceed somewhat leisurely, if only for the sake of the illusion, for that number of years, 1843 years, is an exceptionally generous allotment of time, likely to put me in a predicament the opposite of that in which our philosophers find ourselves." And he means the philosophers of the contemporary time, "whom the time usually permits only an indication of their meaning. And the opposite also to that of our historians, who find that not the material, but the time leaves them in the lurch, because there's such a big gap for them. I do not by any means doubt that you have completely understood and assented to the newest philosophy," so the Hegelian idealism, right? "which, like the modern age, generally seems to suffer from a curious distraction, confusing promise with performance, the superscription with the execution. For what age and what philosophy was ever so wonderful and wonderfully great as our own, in superscription. So, you know, what he's saying there, again, sort of a barb before we actually begin, is that one of the problems with philosophy is that it has a tendency to declare certain problems settled, certain solutions discovered, and it issues a lot of promissory notes that oftentimes when you start reading, it can't back up. You know, on my part, I'd be less inclined to look to Hegel and more inclined to look to somebody like Kant or Spinoza, you know, both of whom are very influential on Hegel. Spinoza just makes declarations, well, this is the way it is, and, you know, this is the way we have to understand things from now on. And for a long time, everyone says, well, that's, you know, we're not going to buy that. But then a lot of people start buying it. And you'll find people who will, you know, cite Spinoza and quote Spinoza as if, well, that's just the last word on things. Thankfully, not too many of them. And he's got, you know, a sort of deductive process that actually turns out to have all sorts of gaps in it when you look at it carefully. Kant is also kind of, you know, funny along those lines, because he not only declares large parts of former philosophy basically off limits, he's sort of like a global building inspector of philosophy who gets to condemn whatever he wants and say, no, don't do anything over there. That's no longer any good. Only over here. But when he provides you explanations of things, I often find huge gaps in his own explanations where he doesn't seem to see that his explanations wouldn't be satisfying. You know, for instance, I've never been able to fully grasp precisely what it is that Kant means by desire. And it's something that I grasp perfectly well, at least experientially. Maybe it's something sort of like Augustine's conception of time, where I can't give you a articulate conception of it if I'm asked to do so. But I seem to operate pretty well in it. Well, Kierkegaard is saying that a lot of the philosophy of his time is suffering from the same sort of defects or deficits, that it doesn't make good on his promises. We're going to see why, in part because he's going to be tying those kinds of philosophy with necessity and with essence, or with what he's going to call cognition. And he's going to say that they are unable to really grasp what's going on in faith. So now that we've discussed the whole point of the interlude and some of the preliminary material, let's look at these different parts. There are 4 parts to this, and the first 3 parts are actually fairly quick, but we don't want to go through them, you know, too quickly and lose sight of what's going on here, because this is some fairly high-level, pretty important commitment being made kind of metaphysics going on here. Kierkegaard is actually acting as a straight-out philosopher, comparing his own views to those of other classic philosophers, including Aristotle, Plato, of course Hegel, and the Greek skeptics, Descartes, some of these other great thinkers throughout time. So he's making sense out of something. And he starts out by considering the question of change. So this is, you know, again, pretty big stuff. Aristotle starts out the Metaphysics, basically, after he goes through a lengthy historical review, talking about the different kinds of changes. And metaphysics is, in a certain respect, it's about what's necessary, what has to be, what lies beyond all of the appearances and contingencies. But it's also about coming to understand change, what it really is. The physics for Aristotle is about change too. It's about the natural world. And I suppose you could say the ethics, the politics, all these other works are also about change of a different sort. But the metaphysics is about the nature of change itself. And here we're getting into that very field. So he says, in what sense is there change in that which comes into existence? So he's not talking about the necessary. We're going to see him draw a complete wedge between that which is necessary and that which comes into existence. He says, what is the nature of the coming into existence kind of change? So there's more than one type of change, and these are fundamentally different categories. There's a coming into existence kind of change, and then he says all other change, becoming other, becoming different, becoming alien, presupposes the existence of that which changes, even when the change consists in ceasing to exist. So this is a really important point to get straight about from the beginning. Let's take this pencil, for example. Now, this pencil exists, right? You know, because you're seeing it right now. It may cease to exist by the time that we're actually viewing this or showing this, depending on how long these videos last. I'm guaranteed it's going to outlast this pencil. Now, this pencil has certain qualities, right? It's made of certain things. It's got this eraser. It's got this graphite part. As I rub with it, it wears down. That is a change. That's a becoming different. As it shortens, as I sharpen it more and more, that's becoming different. And as a color, the color could change. It could, something could react with this paint and turn it white, turn it black, turn it, spotted colors. It could mold. It could, all sorts of things could occur to it. The wood itself, I suppose, could undergo certain things. If I bite down on it like this, I'm changing it in a certain way, right? That's all becoming other. That all presupposes that there's something already there. There's another type of change, and I don't want to say that it's necessarily more fundamental metaphysically, because these are all very fundamental. But it is different. Coming into existence is different. Anything that involves this pencil, the pencil already exists. What was it that brought this into existence? Now we're looking at a different kind of process, a different kind of basis. So he says, you can't say that there is, already something which changes with coming into existence, because it's about existing, right? He says, if the subject of coming into existence does not itself remain unchanged during the change of coming into existence, that which comes into existence is not this subject which comes into existence, but something else. Now that's a little bit tricky to wrap your head around. So what does he mean there? He's saying that whatever it is that's coming into existence, once it actually does come into existence, its nature must be what it actually is, or else something else came into existence. Later on he's going to talk about this in terms of different possibilities. So he says a little bit further on, coming to existence change is not a change in essence. See, it's possible for some things that are changing by becoming other to change in essence. Biting this does not change its essence, right? I suppose reducing it to powder would change its essence if I were just to, or grinding this up into bits or something like that. It would no longer have the form of a pencil. It would no longer have the same sort of purpose. Coming into existence kind of change is not a change in essence, but in being, and is a transition from not existing to existing. So then he gets a little bit more technical here. He says, this non-being which the subject of coming into existence leaves behind. So, when something comes into existence, first it doesn't exist, then it's going to exist. So it has non-being here, and now over here, and I understand we're doing spatial things, so it's not quite, perfect yet. When it becomes something that is real, something that does exist, it now has being. So what about this non-being that it left behind? He says, this non-being must itself have some sort of being. That's a very radical metaphysical move. And I think a lot of people won't really realize what Kierkegaard is doing at that point. He's saying that non-being of the thing which comes into existence has a certain kind of being. So he's actually floating the possibility of broaching the law of identity, the law of the excluded middle, these fundamental rules of logic or thought. Kierkegaard's Metaphysics is one which actually is consistent, but is kind of hard to wrap your head around unless you're paying very close attention to what's going on. So he says, Otherwise, the subject of coming into existence would not remain unchanged during the change of coming into existence, unless it had not been at all. And then the change of coming into existence would for another reason be absolutely different from every other kind of change, since it would be no change at all. For every change always presupposes something which changes. But such a being, which is nevertheless a non-being, is precisely what, here's how he's going to deal with this, possibility is. The kind of being that non-being possesses, the non-being which things which come into existence have, is possibility. Possibility is not actuality. Aristotle realized this a long time ago. There's a fundamental difference between the two of them. And it's difficult to explain exactly what possibility consists in. A lot of people, when they're doing their metaphysics, they kind of push possibility over to the other side and make it into something like a type of actuality. Kierkegaard is trying to resist that. So he says, a being which is being is indeed actual being or actuality. So something that actually possesses existence, or possesses is really the wrong word, something that does exist now is actual. It has become actual. And the change of coming into existence is a transition from possibility to actuality. You notice I've written a lot of different possibles over here. You'll see why in just a moment. Now, he changes here. He says, can the necessary come into existence? And some metaphysicians have thought that the necessary not only can come into existence, but has come into existence. You know, that there are some things that are necessary that, like say the laws of nature, for example. They are necessary, but they came into existence at a certain time. Say if God, created them or something like that. Kierkegaard rejects that kind of view. He says anything that is actually necessary, it always is. As a matter of fact, it's a little bit misleading even to say always. At every point in time, it already is. Because it's necessary, because it couldn't possibly be otherwise. So he says, can the necessary come into existence? Well, coming into existence is a change, but the necessary cannot be changed, since it always relates itself to itself and relates itself to itself in the same way. That's what it means to be necessary. That's a fairly dialectical or Hegelian way of putting it. And so let me read that to you one more time. It always relates itself to itself and relates itself to itself the same way. That's a little bit more, to say that is a little bit more than to say it always is. It relates itself to itself and always in the same way. So it doesn't change in that sense. So he says all coming into existence, to the contrary, is a suffering. And the necessary cannot suffer. It cannot undergo the suffering of the actual, which is that of the possible. Not only the excluded possibility, when something becomes possible, it becomes possible, or when something possible becomes actual, it does so out of a range of a number of different possibilities. For example, at one point in time, I could have gone many different ways in my career paths. Those are no longer live possibilities for me now, even though I could, say, take some of them up as a second career. I can never be Greg Sadler becoming, say, a data entry person back in 1994. Instead, I chose a different path. At that time, I actually chose to work in a gas station and then become a security guard and work in a cafe while I prepared to go to graduate school. Those possibilities were closed off, and one of the possibilities became actual. That's what it means actually to exist. That we're continually undergoing this process of possibilities, some of them you might say being pinched off, and one of them sort of getting through and becoming the one that actually becomes the reality. So he says, everything which comes into existence proves precisely by coming into existence that it's not necessary. For the only thing which cannot come into existence is the necessary, because the necessary already is. So then he poses this issue. He says, is not necessity then a synthesis of possibility and actuality? He says. Now this is sort of a typical, Hegelian movement. He says, what would that mean? Possibility and actuality don't differ in essence, but in being, in whether they really exist or not. How could this difference, from this difference, be formed a synthesis constituting necessity, which is not a determination of being, but a determination of essence, since it's the essence of the necessary to be? If these two things, possibility and actuality, which aren't really things, they're conditions, could be united to become necessity, they would become an absolutely different essence, which is not a kind of change. And in becoming necessity or the necessary, they would become that which alone of all things excludes coming into existence, which would not make sense then from Kierkegaard's perspective. So you can't overcome this gap, you can't bring them together. When he's talking about a synthesis, you can't bring possibility and actuality together under like one single concept that would embrace both of them and unite them and somehow have its own inner necessity. Instead, possibility and actuality are something much more exciting than what is necessary. So, let's go on a little bit more. He says, the necessary is a category entirely by itself. Nothing ever comes into existence with necessity. Likewise, the necessary never comes into existence. Coming into existence is something very special in Kierkegaard's Metaphysics. That's why this is existentialism. Existence matters. He says, the necessary never comes into existence, and something by coming into existence never becomes the necessary. This is going to be a very important point. He criticizes Aristotle. I'm going to skip over that criticism very quickly. And he says, the change involved in coming into existence is actuality. The transition, you notice there's one other thing on the board that we haven't actually talked about yet. The transition takes place with freedom. I should put freedom right next to this. Kierkegaard is going to contrast a cause and a rational ground or a necessary ground. A cause, in Kierkegaard's Metaphysics, is ultimately something free. A cause is something that determines something else, that makes it be what it is. So for example, this chalk, if we want to think about this in terms of Aristotle's four causes, it has a material cause, right? It's made out of calcium, carbonate or something like that. It has a certain form, a certain shape that has been impressed upon it. It was brought into being by somebody operating on some kind of machine, I suppose, to form this chalk. And it has a certain purpose, which you see demonstrated right here, right? Now, for Kierkegaard, each one of these causes ultimately stems from something free. We tend to think of cause as already involving necessity or determinism or something like that. Kierkegaard says, no, cause by itself, the very conception of it, ultimately, brings us back to freedom. So he says, all coming into existence takes place with freedom, not by necessity. Nothing comes into existence by virtue of a logical ground, but only by a cause. Every cause terminates in a freely affecting cause, in something choosing, in something saying, yes, this, not that, in something closing off, again, that manifold of possibilities and making this possibility be the one that bursts forth into actuality. Now, that's not to say that it's all necessarily humanly caused, but that there is freedom within the universe, and not just freedom, like in one global sense, but freedoms, and that these are what all things ultimately trace back to. So he says, every cause terminates in a freely affecting cause. The illusion occasioned by the intervening causes, because there's a whole chain of causes, is that the coming into existence seems to be necessary, The truth about intervening causes is that just as they themselves have come into existence, they point back ultimately to a freely affecting cause. Even the possibility of deducing consequences from a law of nature, which is, typical of modern philosophy, right? We have this whole law, these systems of laws of nature, and maybe they've been reduced down to mathematics in some people's views, right? This gives no evidence for the necessity of any coming into existence. And he says this is clear as soon as one reflects definitively on coming into existence. The same is the case with manifestations of freedom, provided we do not let ourselves be deceived by the manifestations of freedom, but reflect on the coming to existence. Now, what does that mean? This is the very end of the first section. When we think about human actions, which are not just coming out of freedom, but in many respects embody our freedom, sometimes we think that, well, if we can provide some sort of reason for them, then they're determined, they're caused. And what we're forgetting is that there's always the play of freedom going on with them, because something is being brought into existence, and whatever is being brought into existence is not necessary, according to Kierkegaard. Let's go to the second section now. Now he's going to bring up another category, the historical. And he says, so everything that has come into existence is eo ipso, by that very nature, historical. For even if it accepts no further historical predicate, it nevertheless accepts the one decisive historical predicate: it has come into existence. He's going over this fairly quickly. And, you might be tempted when you hear this category, the historical, to think that what he means by that is, the kind of history that we have in books. What he means is the kind of existence that we actually live out. We live out historical existence. We exist through time. We have a past, actually like a whole jumbled up past, or, still trailing behind us almost like a bunch of, shadows and tin cans at the same time, right? We have a present moment, and then we have a sort of future that we're headed towards, and our history overlaps with other people's history. It's part of the meaning of human existence to be historical in this sense. So he says, the historical is the past. For the present, pressing upon the confines of the future, has not yet become historical. Okay, that makes perfect sense. How then can it be said that nature, though immediately present, is historical, except in the sense of the said ingenious speculation? The difficulty comes from the fact, he says, that nature is too abstractive a dialectic with respect to time in the stricter sense. Nature continues on, and everything that happens in nature is not actually happening out of necessity, the kind of necessity that would always be occurring all the time. But it's not as developed, right? There's not as much going on there. There are free causes operative, but not in the same sense as with human beings. So he says, coming into existence may present a reduplication, that is, the possibility of a second coming into existence within the first coming into existence. So imagine this process right here reduplicated. The possibilities being sort of channeled into one single one which survives, all the rest of them remain back in non-being, and that possibility then becomes actuality. Now imagine this turned in upon itself, and you have a human being. A human being that can reflect upon itself, decide what sorts of possibilities it wants to embrace and what types it wants to reject, can hold itself accountable for these things, can hold other human beings accountable for these sorts of things. So he says, here we have the historical in the stricter sense, subject to a dialectic with respect to time. And he says, the more specifically historical coming into existence occurs by the operation of a relatively freely affecting cause. Now, what does he mean by that? He means human being. A relatively freely affecting cause. That's a brilliant way of putting things. Are we completely free as human beings? Absolutely not. Anybody who thinks that they're completely free or that any other human being is completely free, has no things, pushing them this way or pushing them that way or drawing them, is not thinking things through very clearly. But does that mean that we don't have any freedom at all? No, we're relatively free. We're a relatively free affecting cause, bringing things from possibility in ourselves, in the world, in other people, in meaning, all sorts of different modes there, from possibility to actuality. So he says, this in turn points ultimately towards an absolutely freely affecting cause, which would be God. Now he doesn't follow this through. He's not, as we've seen earlier, he's not particularly interested in trying to prove God's existence through some sort of philosophical argument. He could actually try to do that from this, but he doesn't. Instead, that's the end of the section 2. Now he goes to section 3, called the past. And here you get to see him sort of peel back the veil. And here's where he's saying, this is where I take my stand. My metaphysics does not see the past as necessary. And you might say, well, who cares? Well, that's not a very important step. It actually is. Because there's quite a few ways of looking at reality and at time that decide to see the past and things that have occurred in the past as not only not being able to be otherwise than they are, but as necessarily being what they are. So he says, let's grant that once something is past, it can't be changed, right? What has happened and cannot be undone. Is this immutability identical with the immutability, the unchangeability of the necessary? He says, no. Well, why not? The immutability of the past, of things in the past, for instance, of my showing you this pencil rather than showing you a different pencil, the immutability of that has been brought about by a change, namely the change of coming into existence. Such an immutability does not exclude all change, since it didn't exclude this change. All change is excluded only by being excluded in every moment. So if you want to say that all change is excluded, you have to say all change is excluded from the beginning of time all the way to the end of time. Now think about past things. Past things that came into being at a point in time. At the point in time that they came into being, it had to be possible for that to be. It also had to be possible for that not to be, or else they would be necessary, right? You can't, presume that they're necessary, because we're trying to work our way backwards. If they were possible, if they could have been otherwise at the point in time where they actually occurred and now came into being and now can't be changed, that means that they're not necessary. Because in order to be necessary, they'd have to be necessary throughout the entire timeline, Kierkegaard is saying. So he says, how is it that we can actually think about it as necessary? Well, that comes because we forget that things have actually come into existence. We treat them in a different way. We think about them in a different way. We forget something when we do that. So he says, the immutability of the past consists in the fact that it's actual thus. It's that. That it is the case, that it is this way, cannot become different. But does it follow from this that it's possible how could not have been realized in a different manner? That another possibility with a different how could have been the one that actually won through. Now he says, the immutability of the necessary consists in its constant relating itself to itself, in relating itself to itself always in the same manner, excluding any change. Something coming to be has a relation to its own past that can be different. You could be different than you are at all different sorts of points. Everything around you could be different. This video could be shot differently. That's what makes it so, you might say in certain respects, irreplaceable. That's what makes it actual. that's what gives it the almost, mystery. He doesn't use the word mystery here, but mystery of coming to be, of existence. The necessary doesn't have that. And the necessary is what you can sort of wrap your head around and put into a catalog. You can't put existence into a catalog for Kierkegaard. So now he says the future hasn't happened yet, but the future is no less necessary than the past. The past did not become necessary by coming into existence. So the future, the past, the present, none of them are necessary. So he says, the past has come into existence. Coming into existence is the change of actuality brought about by freedom. If the past had become necessary, it would no longer belong, this is very important, it would no longer belong to freedom. It would belong to necessity. If the past, and let's think about this in terms of ourselves, if what we have made of ourselves and our relationships with others and our own understanding of where we've been and where we've gone and where we're headed to, if that became necessary by, coming into being, what would freedom matter? Once you've used it, it's gone and it all becomes necessary. Kierkegaard is holding out for a very robust sense of freedom here. That's something actually myself I find very attractive in his work. So he says, freedom would be, in a sorry case, both an object of laughter and deserving of tears, since it would be responsible for what it did, or it would be responsible for what did not belong to it, being destined to bring offspring into the world for necessity to devour. Freedom itself would be an illusion, and coming into existence, no less so. Freedom would be a witchcraft, and coming into existence, a false alarm. So, before we go on to the fourth and largest section, it's worth, thinking this over. When we do metaphysics, quite often the goal is to arrive at some sort of necessary scheme. Things must be this way. Something we can sort of, articulate in terms of cognitions that every rational person could grasp. If Kierkegaard is right, that's actually a cul-de-sac that you don't want to go into. Because the best that you can do in a cul-de-sac is keep turning around and round and round, right? You can't actually go through to get to the other side. So now, we're going to look at the big section. You notice I've changed things on the board around somewhat, in part because this last section, section 4 of the interlude, is where everything comes to a crux. Sections 1, 2, and 3, we're bringing into sight a bunch of different metaphysical categories: necessity, freedom, temporality with past, present, and future, the notion of cause versus necessary or logical or rational ground, and then possibility and actuality, these sort of classic metaphysical categories. But all of that's been leading up to this section where Kierkegaard is trying to look at how, in fact, we apprehend the past as past. And here he's going to touch on something that has to do very much with the nature of existence, human existence in particular, but existence as a whole in general. So he titles this section The Apprehension of the Past, and that's what he's actually starting with. And you notice I've written a lot of different qualifications that apply to the past that come up in this chapter. So I'm going to run through these very quickly. The past for Kierkegaard, and this may seem like a trivial point at first, but it's not, is what has come into existence. So there's something special about coming into existence. We've already seen that anything that comes into existence is going to be something that's quite different than that which is necessary or a necessity. It involves some sort of free cause, ultimately. So that leads to the second point. It's not necessary, and it never becomes so. The past, for Kierkegaard, and there's a very firm philosophical and metaphysical commitment, just because the past is past and has happened and is fixed doesn't mean that it's actually necessary. Third point is that it involves this play between certainty and uncertainty, and we'll see how that works out in just a little bit. Another thing that comes in here that we're going to explore a bit as well is that he says there's a passionate sense, an emotion that applies to this, and that's wonder. And that is particularly important because, a lot of philosophers, we know from them philosophy begins in wonder, right? So we're going to want to look at that. Another key characteristic is that the past is not given as the past to us through the senses. That might be a little counterintuitive at first, but we'll see what he means by that. And then ultimately it's going to involve, at least for certain aspects of the past, it's going to involve faith or belief and human freedom. So this is where a lot of things are going to come to a knot, as we saw before. He starts out by saying nature as a spatial order has only an immediate existence. So what does that mean? What it means is that nature doesn't have a past in the way that culture, history, human beings have a past. Sure, you can go and find fossils, and you can, cut trees down and see the rings, so there's traces of processes that went on. All those are contingent. None of those are absolutely necessary, Kierkegaard would say. But they don't have a meaning to them. We give them meaning. We find them and make something of them. They don't by themselves have what he would call a dialectical progression, or they're not dialectically involved. So he says everything that admits of a dialectic with respect to time is characterized by a certain duality, in that after having been present, it can persist as past. So this is something very different. The human being has a past that you could think of as trailing behind them. Again, we have to resort to these spatial metaphors in order to make sense of these sorts of things. So the human being has a past. Human cultures have a past. Human groups have a past. They were originally present, and that's a point which is going to be very important to keep in mind when we look at the way in which coming to be or coming into existence works. So he says the essentially historical is always the past. Why? Because it's already over, right? It's already taken place. And as past, it has its own actuality. For the fact that it's happened is certain and dependable. So we're seeing this play of certainty there, right? It's certain, it's dependable. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Abraham Lincoln was shot. I did, hold a job at 100 East Wisconsin in 1994 and 1995. Those are sort of fixed points, and nothing is going to change those. He says, but the fact that it has happened is, on the other hand, the ground of an uncertainty, by which the apprehension will always be prevented from assimilating the past as if it had been thus from all eternity. So what does he mean there about uncertainty? Does that mean that now suddenly we can say, well, maybe I didn't do that. Maybe Abraham Lincoln wasn't shot. Everything turns into like a grand conspiracy theory, or we all become skeptics. That's not what Kierkegaard is saying. He's saying that for any past event, anything which came into being, came into existence, it didn't have to be that way. It could have been otherwise. That's what it means to be able to come into existence. So, how is this going to play out? Like he says, only in terms of this conflict between certainty and uncertainty, the distinguishing mark of all that has come into existence, and hence also the past, can the past be understood. So in order for us to understand what it is for something to actually be past, we have to understand this play of certainty and uncertainty. We have to grasp what we would call contingency of the past thing. So he says, when the past is understood in any other manner, and what would be other manners? Well, some of the manners of certain philosophers, certain theologians, who see the past as completely determined and as necessitated. The apprehension has misunderstood itself in the role of apprehension. And it has misunderstood its object as if anything such could be the object of an apprehension. Every apprehension of the past which proposes to understand it better by construing it has only the more thoroughly misunderstood it. So again, you know, if you want a metaphor for this, imagine somebody who says, I am going to go look for a nail, and they go off, and instead of looking for a nail, they look for screws. And when they find a screw, they say, oh, I've got a nail. Well, no, they didn't actually find a nail. What they did is misconstrue it in the very process of looking for it and finding it. So he says, the past is not necessary since it came into existence. It did not become necessary by coming into existence. So this is going back to this point. When the past came into existence, it assumed a certain fixity, but that fixity doesn't make it necessary. It doesn't make it have to have been that way from all eternity. He says, still less does it become necessary through somebody's apprehension of it. And here he's targeting, I would say, the materialistic philosophers on the one hand and some of the idealistic philosophers like Hegel on the other hand. It's not the case that by our understanding it, we thereby provide to it a kind of necessity that it didn't have before. And he talks about a kind of intellectual illusion that's similar to an optical illusion. You remember, too, we talked about acoustic illusions before, back in the appendix. Now, actually, we're looking at an optical kind of illusion. He says, distance in time tends to promote this illusion, just like distance in space provokes a sensory illusion. A contemporary does not perceive the necessity of what comes into existence. Why not? Because the contemporary is there. The contemporary knows that things could be different because they were there. They actually saw that it could have gone this way or it could have gone this way. There was a whole range of possibilities that got shrunk down to one, which then became actuality, which became the one which prevailed. What happens, though, with distance? Well, distance in time, centuries intervening between the event and the beholder, suddenly we start to think that things are necessary. So we look at Rome and we say, well, ancient Rome had to fall. But it didn't have to fall. And we say Abraham Lincoln had to have been assassinated. Well, that's a little bit of a tougher one because there's a lot of events that could have changed and been differently. But we see some sort of internal necessity to these quite often. So he says, if the past became necessary through being apprehended, then the apprehension would actually be changing things. The object of apprehension would be changed as well. So he goes on and he says, whoever apprehends the past, historica philosophus, that is a philosopher of history, again, targeting Hegel and people like him, is therefore a prophet in retrospect. That is, a prophet expresses the fact that the certainty of the past is based on an uncertainty. What does he mean there? Again, the certainty that the past has taken, the fixity, the determination of it, it exists on a ground of possibility. It could have been otherwise. Now, it can't be otherwise at this point in time, but at the time when it was present, when it was developing, when it was occurring, there were other possibilities which were not realized. So he says the historian, then, when he encounters the past, he has to encounter it through an emotion. And this is a really interesting observation, because what he's bringing up here, this is going to lead us to the sense of wonder. What he's bringing up here has to do not only with the historian, but also with the philosopher, also with the theologian, the religious person in general. And you might say that there's a nexus tying all these together that's not being explicitly spelled out here, but which could be looked at this point, could be highlighted at this point. So he says, the historian thus again confronts the past, moved by the emotion which is the passionate sense for coming into existence. We have a sense, we have a way of apprehending coming into existence, and that way of apprehending it is not primarily a solely intellectual thing. It's something that is effective. It touches us in the heart. It has to do with the very depth of our being. And he says, what is that? That's wonder. Now, that should make us think at this point about Aristotle's dictum that philosophy also begins in wonder. That from the beginning, and he's saying this actually in the Metaphysics, from the beginning, we wondered at things. We wondered at, say, natural phenomenon, or we wondered, we were in amazement, we were stupefied by it, we wanted to understand, we were provoked towards a kind of awe, towards, well, the very fact of being itself, or things being how they are and not having turned out otherwise. These are all things that we can feel wonder at. And so the historian feels wonder, and he says, if the philosopher never finds occasion to wonder, he has nothing to do with the historical. For wherever the process of coming into existence is involved, as is the case in relation to the past, there the uncertainty attaching to the most certain of events, the uncertainty of coming into existence, can find expression only in this passion. That's a key point too. It can find its expression only in this passion, not in some other passion, not in, say, anger, not in indignation, not in sadness, not in even joy, only in wonder. So he says, this is as necessary to the philosopher as it is worthy of him. Even if the event is certain in the extreme, even if wonder offers its consent in advance, saying that if this had not happened, it would have to be invented. Like, for example, people said that about the idea of God, that, Voltaire was very famous for saying this. If God did not exist, he would have to be invented. Even then, the passion of wonder would fall into contradiction with itself, he says. Let's go on from here. So much for the apprehension of the past. We have, in the meanwhile, presupposed the knowledge of the past is given, because we do, in fact, have knowledge of the past. How is such knowledge to be acquired? And he says the historical cannot be given to the senses. That's a really interesting thing to say, because, what do we think about when we think of history? We think of people writing down what it is that they observed, right? Observed through the senses. So if history is just a record of things that took place, things that occurred, and we look for, say, eyewitnesses, aren't we relying on them and their senses and the records of what it is that they perceive through the senses? Well, Kierkegaard says yes and no. He says the historical cannot be given immediately to the senses. That doesn't mean that our senses aren't involved, but they're not given immediately to the senses, since the elusiveness of coming into existence is involved in it. I'm going to repeat that because that's a very important way of framing it. The elusiveness of coming into existence is involved in it. There's two things here. Coming into existence is not the same thing as simply being. Coming into existence means being able to arise out of a ground of possibility that precluded other possibilities. So, what do we have here? He says, the immediate impression of a natural phenomenon or of an event is not the impression of the historical. So what we're seeing when something occurs is not the historical yet. The coming into existence involved cannot be sensed immediately, but only the immediate presence. But the presence of the historical includes the process of coming into existence. And he says, here we're actually going to make a little detour into epistemology, the theory of knowledge. And he says, immediate sensation and immediate cognition cannot deceive. This is by itself enough to show that the historical cannot be the object of either. Why not? Because the historical has the elusiveness that is implicit in all coming into existence. It eludes us. It gets away from us. It's the sort of thing that we perceive, you might say, out of the corner of our eye. It's that additional surplus which is given to the events that constitutes their true meaning. That's very hard to pin down, very hard to articulate. So he uses the example of a star. He says, when the observer sees a star, the star becomes involved in doubt the moment he seeks to become aware of its having come into existence. So much then is clear. The organ for the historical must have a structure analogous with the historical itself. It must comprise a corresponding somewhat by which it may repeatedly negate in its certainty the uncertainty that corresponds to the uncertainty of coming into existence. Now that's a mouthful, so let's go through that again very slowly and figuring out what he's trying to say there, right? The historical and the apprehension of the historical must comprise a corresponding somewhat, and I'm not even sure exactly what that means, by which it may repeatedly negate in its certainty. So while the historical events themselves are fixed, they have taken place, you can rely on them, they have certainty, they negate in its certainty the uncertainty that corresponds to the uncertainty of coming into existence. So it negates the, well, it could have been different. It negates the, well, you know, this really doesn't matter that much because it could have been all these other different ways. It imbues it with a kind of greater certainty, as he says. So he goes on and he says, what is this uncertainty? This uncertainty of coming into existence. He says it's twofold. The nothingness of the antecedent non-being is one side of it. Now remember, what was the antecedent non-being? All these other possibilities that are not realized. That was the ground of non-being. He said, even that non-being has a certain kind of being, and that being is what? Possibility. So the nothingness of that is one side of it, while the annihilation of the possible is another, the latter being at the same time the annihilation of every other possibility. You might say that in every single choice, every single action, every single decision, every single juncture, every single event, a kind of miracle is taking place, a metaphysical miracle in which this range of possibilities, which don't actually have being, they are non-being, but a peculiar kind of non-being that isn't fully non-being, right? Suddenly are dissolved or taken away or compressed into one single possibility. Like he says, the annihilation of every other possibility. When we make a choice and something radically new, something important comes into being as a result, we realize one possibility and all the other possibilities suddenly lose their status as possibilities. That happens in every single case of something that comes into existence. So history is just full of these moments in which this occurs. So here's where he makes a transition to talking about faith. And he says, faith has precisely the required character. For in the certainty of belief, there is always present a negated uncertainty, in every way corresponding to the uncertainty of coming into existence. Faith believes what it does not see. It does not believe the star is there, for that it sees. But it believes that the star has come into existence. The same holds true of an event. The what of a happening may be known immediately through the senses, right? You can just perceive what's going on. But by no means can it be known immediately that it has happened, its significance, what it means for it to be this event, this realized possibility, rather than these other realized possibilities. So he says, the elusiveness pertaining to an event consists in its having happened, in which fact lies the transition from nothing, from non-being, and from the manifold possible how, all the different range of possibilities. Something comes into existence. Every time something comes into existence, the appropriate response to that, according to Kierkegaard, is wonder. So he says, immediate sensation and immediate cognition have no suspicion of the uncertainty with which belief approaches its object. But neither do they suspect the certainty which emerges from this uncertainty. And here he goes into a sort of long digression that I'm not going to go through all of, where he's talking about skepticism and Greek skepticism. And the thing that I want to draw from this is just this. Doubt can be overcome only by a free act, an act of will, he says. Why? Well, because doubt does not emerge from necessity. Doubt itself is a free act of the doubting person. It is a choice. Sometimes people say, oh, I can't possibly have any sort of belief. There's nothing I can rely on. Kierkegaard would say, well, that's actually a choice on your part. You're acting like the skeptics of old times, who actually were at least self-conscious in their doubting. If you look at Descartes, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you actually look at Descartes, he has to work really, really hard in order to carry out this project of hyperbolic doubt. And in the transition from the first to the second meditation, he actually says, hey, I got to take a break because I'm not able to keep this up. Now, maybe that's just a literary device, but I don't think that it is. I think that Kierkegaard is right, that both belief or faith and doubt involve an act of will, involves some sort of drive, choice, decision made on the part of the person who has them. So he says, if that's the case, what's the upshot of this for knowledge? Well, it now becomes easy to see that belief is not a form of knowledge, but a free act and expression of will. It believes the fact of coming into existence and has thus succeeded in overcoming within itself the uncertainty that corresponds to the nothingness of the antecedent non-being, the range of possibilities. It believes the thus of what has come into existence, and it has consequently succeeded in annulling within itself the possible how. Without denying the possibility of another thus, the present thus is for belief most certain. So if this is the case, then faith is something which we could have not only in God or a religious text or something like that, but more generally for Kierkegaard, at least for the Kierkegaard of this text. I'm going to go on now, and he says, when we have faith, or when we have belief, we're not inferring from effect to cause. So we don't see, for example, the works of God and then say, aha, I recognize those are the works of God, because they have to have a sort of cause like that, the way Thomas Aquinas' proofs, for example, work. He says, I cannot sense or know immediately that what I sense or know immediately is an effect. This is very interesting too. What this means is that in order to grasp metaphysical principles at work, to grasp the metaphysical, or to use somebody else's word, sapiential dimension of things, which is just as real as their surfaces and just as real as our thoughts of them, in order to grasp these aspects of them, we have to go beyond just the immediate senses and beyond immediate cognition or rationality. So he says, I believe that it is an effect. Now notice, belief involves an act of the will. In order to grasp something as an effect of a metaphysical cause, you actually have to choose that on some level. You have to allow yourself, at least, to be open to that interpretation. So he says, I believe that it is an effect, for in order to bring it under this category, I must have already made it doubtful with the uncertainty implicit in coming into existence. When belief resolves to do this, doubt has been overcome. In that very instance, the indifference of doubt, the sort of everything being sort of put in suspense, what he calls an equilibrium, has been dispelled. Not by knowledge, not by being given the one thing that will clear up everything, but by will, by choice, by commitment, by decision. Very important point here. Something that brings Kierkegaard into contact with, say, Pascal or James or a number of other important philosophers. So he says, thus it will be seen that belief is the most disputable of things while in the process of approximation. So, if one's belief depends on, well, if I get a little bit more evidence, then I'll believe a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more, it becomes very doubtful in that case. That's not what he thinks belief really ought to be like. He says, it's the least disputable when one's constituted by virtue of its new quality. Belief is the opposite of doubt. Belief and doubt are not two forms of knowledge, for neither of them is a cognitive act. That's getting really interesting. So now, belief and doubt involve acts of will. neither are a cognitive act, what does that leave open? Well, the realm of the affective, passion, emotion, desire. He says they are opposite passions. Belief is a passion, doubt is a passion. They both involve drive, desire, mood, the very depths of our being, the way in which we grasp existence as existence. So he says, belief is a sense for coming into existence, and doubt is a protest against every conclusion that transcends immediate sensation and immediate cognition. So really we have three things. We have sensation, which can only tell us what we perceive. Cognition, which can only tell us what we think. And hopefully these kind of connect up together. And then we have what comes into existence. And belief is what is needed to grasp that as what comes into existence. Not just how it looks, not just how we think about it, but in its very contingency, in the fact that it didn't have to go that way, in its gratuitousness, you might say, in its being, in its historical existence. So he goes on, and he says, at no time does the past become necessary, just as it was not necessary when it came into existence, nor revealed itself as necessary to the contemporary who believed it, that is, believed that it had come into existence. For belief and coming into existence correspond to one another and are concerned with the two negative determinations of being, namely the past and the future, and with the present, insofar as it is conceived by the point of view of a negative determination of being, namely as having come into existence. Necessity, on the other hand, is wholly a matter of essence, and thus it is of the essence of the necessary to exclude coming into existence. It can never come into existence, the necessary. And that's what our thought grasps, is the necessary, not that which surpasses it. You can ask yourself at this point, well, where does God fit into all of this? He hasn't really brought that up yet. God is going to be beyond the necessary for Kierkegaard. Let me go now into the supplement, his application. He says, what has here been said applies to the historical in the direct and ordinary sense, whose only contradiction is that it has come into existence, which contradiction is implicit in all coming into existence. And he specifies here in a footnote what he means by contradiction. He says, don't take it in Hegel's sense, where contradiction actually has the power to produce something. You know, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, this whole process of negativity. He says, as long as nothing has come into existence, the contradiction is merely the impulsive power in the passion of wonder. When the process of coming into existence has occurred, the contradiction is again present as the nisus of the wonder in the passion, which reproduces the coming into existence. So when he's talking about his contradiction here, you should actually think of this process, this feeling of wonder. Now, he actually does end up talking about God. He says, let us now return to our story and to our hypothesis that the God has been. God has come into existence. God has erupted into our temporal, historical frame. And he says, as far as the direct and ordinary form of the historical is concerned, we have seen that this cannot become historical for immediate sensation or for cognition, either for a contemporary or for a successor. So what can it then be available to? How can we apprehend this? Through faith. He says it's a historical fact, but only for the apprehension of faith. And you might say, oh, well, that's the typical cop-out that religious believers always take. Well, no, because he's actually unpacked what faith means within these metaphysical categories for you. And he says, from the eternal point of view, one does not have faith that the God exists, that is, eternally is, even if one assumes that he does exist. The use of the word faith in this connection enshrines a misunderstanding. If you want to think that God exists eternally, then you can actually do philosophical arguments, theological proofs or things along those lines. That's cognition. That deals with the necessity. That deals with the eternal. Kierkegaard says the historical fact for a contemporary is that the God has come into existence. For the member of a later generation, the historical fact that the God has been present through having come into existence. He walked among us. He entered into the human world of meanings and did things and took, a place at a certain time, did certain acts, made choices. He says no one can become the immediately contemporary with this historical fact. It's the object of faith, since it concerns coming into existence. So then he says our historical fact thus stands before us. It has no immediate contemporary, since it is historical in the first degree, corresponding to faith in the ordinary sense. It has no immediate contemporary in the second degree, since it's based on a contradiction. Remember the paradox, corresponding to faith in the eminent sense. And he says every time the believer makes this fact an object of his faith, every time he makes it historical for himself, he reinstates the dialectical determinations of coming into existence with respect to it. Every time the believer does this, what faith involves is not just some sort of naive leap into the beyond, but you might say something like a participation in what the coming into existence has made possible for us. It realizes, for Kierkegaard, something that's most worked into the possibilities of our humanity, you might say. So, this is where we're going to leave off with this. We have one more chapter to go in this lengthy excursion into Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments.